Well, let me start with a caveat, because when Paula asked me to participate, I thought, I haven't really done much about women's health, and this is Women's Health Research Institute. She said, we want you to talk about your career path as a lawyer, and I'm thinking, I do planning and land use law in my paid work, and I wasn't sure how I'm going to be able to make the link, but I just want to start with a caveat. Yes, I am a lawyer, both by instinct and by training. And I think it's the instinctual stuff that I'd like to leave with you, because I think there are lessons in certain approaches that I've experienced that you might be able to carry off with you and use in your own way as you do your volunteerism. But I need to underscore the fact I'm a lawyer by saying, when all you have is a hammer, everything you see is a nail. And so I have approached my volunteer work, and particularly that in women's health and the areas surrounding it, from that perspective, because I've brought constantly trying to understand, what is the policy regime? What is the legislation that both supports these initiatives, or more usually gets in the way of them? What has to be changed? What has to be done by way of a process in order to get those policy, educational, regulatory, or legislative changes made? Because make no mistake, the law is always there. Sometimes it's there as a social construct to lead. Think of seatbelt legislation. Sometimes it's a social construct there that comes after a social movement. Think about seatbelt legislation, right? So just keep in mind the fact that there is always, 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 I think, a place for law, and that it can create an environment for good or for ill. So my career path. I need to say it's not in my paid work like Valerie. You live your life and life just happens. Somebody said to me in the upper room, oh, you've done so much. And I said, it's because I've lived 3 times longer than you have. So I'm going to talk to you about what I've done in either my volunteer or appointed positions as opposed to paid work. The first is, when I was in law school in 1967, I was involved in student politics, and after that went off to graduate school in the States. In 1970, feminism hadn't yet become a dirty word, and yet was still burgeoning. So I was in grad school with women who had gone undergrad to Harvard and to Yale and to Princeton, and I came across my first ever consciousness raising group. Those of you who've read feminist history might remember that phrase, but it was just illuminating. And it was all these smart women who were doing law, and they started to help me understand the role of law in a social construct. So 1980, I'm coming back and practicing law, and I was asked by my friend and mentor, then Attorney General Roy McMurtry, to go on the Ontario Human Rights Commission. It was relatively new to get going. It had just been given some new rules with respect to protection for gender and sex discrimination. Equal pay for work of equal values was coming along, for example, and he said he thought I could give a hand. I was interested. Well, within weeks, it became clear to me that on-the-job discrimination was what we now know as sexual harassment, but we didn't really have a word for it back then. And that started to become very clear over the 2 years I was on the Human Rights Commission, that women didn't have health. If they didn't have economic protection, they couldn't keep a job. And they didn't have health in the broad scale of things if they couldn't be safe in whatever space they were in, whether at home through domestic abuse, or whether in a workplace or on the street through something like sexual harassment, be it physical or emotional abuse. The impact was not simply personal and emotional, but it was also economic. So that was something I started to clue into about a woman's environment. Then in 1982, I was asked again by the Attorney General to go on what was then called the Metropolitan Toronto Police Commission, and I was the first woman ever appointed, which is shocking. But I went into the police department, and they all looked at me like I was, I don't know, an alien, and a much smaller version of what they had in those days, because they still had height and weight requirements on, for example, for police officers. So if you were a woman or a slight man or from an ethnic group that wasn't particularly big, you weren't on the police commission. Well, we worked on that pretty well and pretty quickly, but women still had different uniforms, different duties. That led to lack of promotion and economic impact, for example, but we were working on all of those things. And then in 1985, there was a really bad summer. There were a number, more than a dozen women were either sexually assaulted badly or were sexually assaulted and murdered. And then Chairman Paul Godfrey was approached by a group of women, Linda Ryan Nye and other feminists in the community, and asked to set up a pink ribbon task force, and I was asked to chair it, given my role on the police commission. And that was the public action, or the public task force rather, on violence against women and children. And again, that underscored if women weren't safe from violence, they couldn't be healthy. There was, of course, stress. There was, of course, people would limit their existence. I certainly felt that because as we were in the 2 years of the task force, Paul Bernardo, we now know, was the Scarborough rapist. And when I would go out to community meetings on an evening, we would be escorted to our cars by the police officers who were there. We had been given tools about how to keep ourselves safe. We all would let our friends off and make sure that she was inside the door and the light was on before we moved on. Everybody was limited. No matter your economic power, we were all under stress and limitations by virtue of threat of violence. And that has something that stayed with me. And the law, being a social construct through legislation and policy, also needs to include education. That was the learning I got out of that. The law sometimes leads, it sometimes follows, but it only operates in a construct. So out of that task force, we did a whole variety of things. There was anti-pornography legislation. There was no means no legislation that came in at the end of the 80s, early 90s around consent for sexual assault. The first ever sexual assault care center in this province was set up. Where else? Women's College. Of course. There was training for police, sexual assault training, all of that kind of stuff. 1985, I went on the Advisory Council for the Status of Women. We're, again, able to start to push those things through. The lesson I got out of that particular venue was if you want to get change, you have to start a campaign. Sometimes it's a political campaign. Sometimes it's a community-based grassroots campaign. Sometimes it's simply calling for change, but you need to target your audience and start talking to them and create an environment where they feel both the need for it and the necessity for it. 1991, I got an opportunity to go back and go over some recommendations that had come out of a review I did in the late 90s, in the late 80s rather, under the Penitentiary Act. Lesson I learned out of that, eternal vigilance. They will backslide if you do not keep your eye on them. And when them, it's anybody who has the power, does the social construct, does the policy, does the regulation. Eternal vigilance is our watchword. Finally, Women's College and what came out of that with Visanthi's assistance. The fight for Women's College started in 1995 and went on right through till we got our independence back in 2006. And let me just say that the lesson I learned out of that is there must be a crucible. There must be a vessel which is the source of the wisdom, which is the spark for the advocacy, which is the home for those who are wanting to gather around that message. And so Women's College was that, and when it was under threat of closure in 1997, then Health Minister Elizabeth Whitmer called me into her office one day and she said, I don't think I'm going to be able to keep the hospital open. What do we do? Because she understood that there had to be a champion and an advocate and a vessel and a place. And so the Women's Health Council was formed, and that's how Visanthi and I got to work shoulder to shoulder. My lesson out of that is always find a champion. Find somebody who can help, who has the power to spread the word, give you money, open doors, whatever it is. You cannot ever do it by yourself. You have to find a champion who can make things happen. And then the final point I have, because Valerie's being good, is I'm a lawyer. You have to pay attention to the evidence. 10 years ago, 12 years ago, people like Paula and the Health Research Institute, Women's Health Research Institute, were starting to be very clear that women were simply medically not small versions of men. Different biology, different everything. And that evidence is very important. It's scientific, it's valid, and it is the evidence on which everything can be based. So track it at all times. Make sure that whatever you're doing by way of a campaign, a push, when you get together to discuss programs and where places to go with people, make sure, please, it's based on the evidence. Thank you, Valerie, for your patience.
Well, it is a bit hard to condense all